start hopefully being able to get in on the attendees side. Yeah, here we go. All right, thank you everyone for coming back. I know I maybe didn't explain it the best. I got a couple of emails from people being like, why can't I get into the webinar? But we are restarting these webinars between each session to give our panelists some time to get ready and get adjusted and to take care of any kind of technical stuff we have to do. So if you're logging on to the Zoom link and it says wait, you know that you have to wait to be admitted to the webinar, that's probably what's happening. We're just taking our 10 minutes to get everything set up for you so that it all makes sense. So it's not that you have the wrong link or that something's gone wrong, but it's just that we kind of need that time to make sure that we're all good on our end, so we're not showing up looking all raggedy in front of you. All right, so this is our 6 p.m. session with Allison Riggs. I'm so excited, and I'm going to introduce her. And I think to a lot of you, she probably needs no introduction. She has been one of the most consistent, biggest faces in redistricting in North Carolina over the past 10 years. And then she's going to talk a little bit to us about some of the work that SCSJ has done and some of the, sort of where we are with redistricting law right now in North Carolina. So thanks, Allison. So this is Allison J. Riggs. She is the Interim Executive Director and Chief Counsel on Voting Rights at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, or SCSJ. Allison leads the Voting Rights Program at SCSJ, an organization she joined in 2009. In March of 2020, she also took over as Interim Executive Director for the organization. Her voting rights work over the last decade at SCSJ has been focused on fighting for fair redistricting plans, fighting against voter suppression, and advocating for electoral reforms that would expand access to voting. She has litigated redistricting cases on behalf of state NAACP conferences in Texas, Florida, Virginia, and North Carolina. In 2018, she argued the Texas redistricting case in the United States Supreme Court. And in 2019, she argued the North Carolina partisan gerrymandering case in the Supreme Court. Allison works closely with grassroots organizations and communities of color as they seek to advance their political and civil rights. So Allison, we are so thrilled to have you here. You are such a powerhouse, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation. So I'll hand it over.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm so honored to be with you all this evening. I appreciate your endurance in what has been a long week. It would certainly be easy to check out, but this topic is incredibly timely and important. And I'm grateful for all of you sharing this time and learning more about how you can be engaged in redistricting this cycle. I'm going to share my screen. I'm not going to do a death by PowerPoint on a Friday night, but I am just wanting to, can folks see my screen?
I can see it, so hopefully everyone else can too.
Oh, you know what I need to do? I'm sorry. Yep. There.
People are saying yes, so I think you're
okay. Good. Excellent. North Carolina, I want to spend about 30 minutes just talking about where we've been, where we're going, and supporting redistricting engagement writ large. And then take some questions, because I think the best way to learn is just to talk about it. So that's the plan for this evening, and I hope that works well. So I know you all are here because you have some awareness, some understanding of what redistricting is, and in fact, I see my client Janet in the chat room. So like some of you are really deep in redistricting, but I think it's some historical mooring is always helpful for helping to talk about how we engage folks and what can be a technical process, and for really like building outrage and movement and passion around a topic that can be a little dry. I like redistricting. I think it's fascinating all the time, but first, it's just sort of understanding the same old problems that persist through gerrymandering. Importantly, for as long as we have been drawing electoral district lines, and we've only been mandated to redraw them to reflect changing population since the 1960s. But as long as we've been drawing district lines, we as a country have been drawing those district lines to disadvantage communities of color. It is a powerful tool of voter suppression, and it's a powerful tool from keeping the voices that we have historically marginalized out of decision-making spaces. And so that's where I always like to start on this. If you don't understand where and how redistricting problems started, it's really hard to have the moral clarity to talk about how to fix them. Gerrymandering is something that happens once a decade, and it's technical. So public awareness of the process in a timely fashion is challenging. Lake has been doing this work for a while, and so we have and others like my organization, the Southern Coalition. So we have a runway, but we'll find that there are a lot of folks who are only starting to engage now, and in fact may only start to engage in the spring or later. I'll get to the timing issues this cycle, but I'm focusing on the old problems. The old problems that persist are just getting the public and folks aware and prepared to engage in a timely fashion is challenging. The other one is one of scale. I find it easier to get folks talking about congressional or state level redistricting, but there is so much local policy made at the municipal level, at the county level. And that redistricting is going to be happening in the next 2 years too. And so getting folks not just to pay attention to the big flashy congressional seats, which are important, but also if you care about SROs in your school and the school to prison pipeline and culturally sensitive curriculum, you need to care how you elect school board members. And so we need to be talking about local redistricting, hence the all caps and underlying, in case anyone missed my message or if I was being too nuanced. I think local redistricting is really important. We will always have self-interested map drawers. I'm actually probably one of the loudest and most annoying voices in the voting rights space saying, hey, if we're going to talk about redistricting reform, we need to, any reform is not good reform. Like it's not like, okay, anything is better than nothing. I don't actually believe that. I think some redistricting reform can actually perpetuate power disparities and actually remove accountability. But dealing with the fact that we know map drawers can be self-interested, naming it and being intentional about how we hold decision makers accountable isn't a bad thing either. There's always going to be in governance a level of self-interest, and being able to engage and navigate with that reality is a challenge, but it's one we can deal with. It's not anything new. The accessibility of technology and expertise has been a same old problem. Yes, technology has increased, but it hasn't completely democratized the space the way folks thought. There are open source redistricting softwares that you can use, and I encourage you to. We teach entire classes using Dave's redistricting app, but it doesn't always have all the data, particularly for local redistricting, so it's not fully democratized. And quite frankly, like, you still need to train people and support people in learning that software. Just putting it out there doesn't make the space democratic and accessible. And we really do need to keep working on applying an intersectional lens to how we think about redistricting. And I say that like the intersections of all of the isms and systems of oppression that go into how we elect decision makers, but understanding that we are making our job harder as activists, as civic engagement warriors. We're making our work harder if we're not connecting the dots more easily on how this intersects with other issues that people care about, like schools, like public health, like criminal justice reform, We need to be not making this a space that only the voting rights and civic engagement world live in. It needs to be redistricting, and redistricting engagement needs to be viewed as an organizing and power building tool. But that's maximized when we look at redistricting through an intersectional lens. So we've had the technology advancements that does, it's good. It doesn't do everything, but it does let us analyze maps faster and bring to bear some new perspectives that I'll talk in a little bit that we haven't had before. Oops, sorry, I have a little typo there. The state of the federal courts and the state of, that's supposed to say the North Carolina courts, changing, right? The federal courts, President Trump appointed a really large number of unqualified, underqualified people to fill federal benches. And that's where we generally go, particularly seeking relief under the Voting Rights Act. So that's a reality. That is the new landscape. The state courts are changing. We've seen new folks elected to the North Carolina Supreme Court, to the Court of Appeals, and we've already seen those election results play out in the administration of the courts. So that's a factor that's going to play into how the redistricting process goes in the state of North Carolina and in local redistricting. In the last few years, we have gotten some bad law on partisan gerrymandering, on intentional discrimination, and some on Section 2. So we will need to deal with that, and the fact that we have federal judges who may not be willing to fairly apply the mandate of Congress as explained in Section 2. But I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer on that. The law as written, particularly under Section 2, and the promises of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, those words still have meaning. And I believe in fighting for maps and laws that comply with federal laws and federal statutes, the words of them. And we'll keep fighting for what's right, and that full promise of equal protection under the law, no matter what. Leica?
Sorry, Allison, not to interrupt you, but someone just asked what is Section 2, and I thought you might want to take a little bit of time just to explain that.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question. Section 2 is a part of the Voting Rights Act designed to ensure that voters of color have equal access to the political process. It applies countrywide, and it's really fleshed out in redistricting. In the redistricting context, Section 2 prohibits redistricting plans or methods of election that don't provide voters of color the equal opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. Most often it's been used to force counties that have conducted at-large elections into single-member district elections, but also the way in which you draw a district line can violate Section 2 by packing or cracking voters of color, thus making it harder for them to elect their candidate of choice. So that is, I'm not discouraged. I mean, my job is frustrating. It's been frustrating and it'll continue to be frustrating, the litigation part of my job. But working with communities and activists like y'all is what gives me hope. And I know that the arc bends towards justice, even if it bends slowly, and we will bend it and see that we live out the promise of the federal Constitution and the laws that we have in place. But I believe in truth telling, so there's challenges on that front. Also, the 2020 census is a bit of a mess. We have a delay on getting the data that tells us how many congressional districts each state will get. So we don't know if North Carolina will still have 13 congressional districts, or if, as we'd hoped, we'll get that 14th district. Normally those numbers come out on December 31st. We're hearing now that it'll be at least March 6th. And those are just total state population numbers that tell us whether we get another congressional district or not. The data that we use for redistricting still will be potentially months behind that. We're also hearing that there's problems with the quality of the data, which should surprise no one given how frustrating census outreach and funding was last year. The administration in place now that conducted the 2020 census certainly didn't demonstrate a good faith effort to try and get an accurate count. And they were sued by civil rights groups quite often, and to much success over the last few years. But still, we find ourselves having census data that we get only once a decade and that we use for redistricting, and there may be problems with it. So all of that, stay tuned. That's where we've been, and that's the landscape. Folks may be wondering, what specifically should I be worried about in North Carolina redistricting? And to tell that story, I'm going to start and talk about what we've seen recently. In 2011, in the state legislative districts and congressional districts, the legislative majority employed a very egregious level of what we call racial gerrymandering in order to pack Black voters into as few districts as possible and minimize their overall political power. They did that by taking districts that were normally shaped and made sense for those communities and drawing them solely on the predominantly on the basis of racial lines, reaching out to grab Black voters and pull them and pack them into a few number of districts. Just as a visual example, and I know there's a lot of numbers on this page, but I really just want you to look at the blue shapes. This is Senate District 14. The version on the right of the screen was what it looked like before the legislature, the North Carolina General Assembly, redistricted in 2011. It was a square. It was essentially the northeast part of Wake County. On the left is what it looked like after they redrew. And in that district, 2 African-American candidates had been, at different times, had been elected with resounding support from white voters, and yet the Republican majority in the legislature said, no, Black voters, we need to draw this district as a majority Black district, even though it's never been a majority Black district. That's how we need to draw it. In order to draw it, though, we have to draw it this crazy way. And so they increased the Black voting age population substantially, and made the surrounding districts more conservative and less friendly to the interests of Black voters. So it was deeply problematic. We sued in a number of cases that these were unconstitutional racial gerrymanders, that you're not supposed to draw redistricting lines either predominantly on the basis of race, unless you have a very good reason for doing so, or to harm communities of color. We won that case, got redrawn state legislative districts. Another case got new congressional districts, but unfortunately that didn't end the story. So in 2016, there was a congressional map redraw. So they redrew the congressional districts after a ruling that they were racial gerrymanders. In 2017, they redrew the state house and the state senate districts. And in both cases, the legislature still refused to be a good actor. When told that they couldn't racial gerrymander, the state said, all right, and state leaders said, all right, if we can't racially gerrymander, we'll partisan gerrymander. And I'll be real clear with you, partisan gerrymanders, and I've litigated a partisan gerrymandering case, while the arguments that I make in court aren't based on racial classifications or based on laws designed to protect certain racial or ethnic groups, partisan gerrymandering is racial gerrymandering. The Southern strategy in the was designed to make one party the party of white people and the other party the party of people of color, and it has been largely successful. And that is a truth, a truism. The intersection between race and politics in this state is, it is inexplicable. It is, you can't break it apart. They are irrevocably intertwined, at least in our current political space. And so understand that the fight against partisan gerrymandering is still a racial justice fight. But the unfortunate thing is, despite all of this litigation, we then had to litigate again on partisan gerrymandering. And so not only did the legislature partisan gerrymander, they also ignored the prohibition on mid-decade redistricting and continued to press every advantage they could in dragging out the legal processes and keeping in place unconstitutional districts. This is an example of the way partisan gerrymanders just perpetuate racial gerrymanders. This is Senate District 28 in Guilford County. Senate District 28 on the left was what a federal court, a bipartisan panel of federal court judges and the United States Supreme Court agreed was a racial gerrymander. That Senate district in the center of Guilford County there was drawn to capture as many Black voters as possible in Guilford County. In 2017, when the legislature redrew that district, they said they switched the race button off on their map. And they sort of cut off a few tiny appendages, but essentially maintained the core of the district and just said it was not a racial gerrymander because they didn't look at race. But I think this shows you the ways in which party and race on a map are aligned. And this map on the right still packed Black voters and Democratic voters into Senate District 28 to the detriment of voters in Guilford County. We, in the federal case challenging the congressional districts, relied on some really fascinating statistical data to make our case that drawing a congressional district map that had a delegation of 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats was an extreme statistical outlier and could only be drawn if the line drawer was intending to disadvantage Democratic voters. We put on what I litigated the case. I may be a little bit biased in this front, but we put on a pretty darn good case with amazing evidence, I think, and took it all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. Unfortunately, in a 5-4 ruling, the United States Supreme Court said the federal courts are not the place to bring these challenges, that it is not the province of the federal courts to be deciding these kinds of political decisions by state legislatures. That's a very disappointing decision. The upside was Common Cause and other litigants in state court took that record that we built in the federal case and were able to litigate quickly in state court and get a state court trial level ruling that the congressional plans and the state legislative plans were unconstitutional partisan gerrymanders under the state constitution. And those maps were redrawn in November and December of 2019 and used for the first time in 2020. And the congressional delegation certainly changed, reflecting that increased fairness. So I guess before I go to the next slide, I will say this cycle, I think the reality is we'll see a mixed bag of strategies used to perpetuate the folks in power staying in power and continuing North Carolina's sad history of litigating redistricting maps every cycle. We have not escaped that in some time. And Senator Berger has suggested that redistricting in the North Carolina General Assembly is going to happen as it's happened before. So we'll be looking for, particularly in the more populous areas of the state, continued strategies of racial gerrymandering. It may be less explicit, but we will be looking for that. The other thing that we think is true is that racially polarized voting has worsened, not gotten better in the last decade. We have seen invitations to the worst side of people's biases and bigotries, and we have seen folks follow the lead set for them in Washington, D.C. And I think that's going to reflect in when we look at how people vote and do the what are called racially polarized voting analyses that are part of the redistricting process. And to be clear, racially polarized voting is something we look at in redistricting. It's the tendency of white voters to prefer white candidates and voters of color to prefer non-white candidates. And that's not always true. Sometimes you will have a candidate of color preferred by conservative white voters, and sometimes there's no absolute, but we can study those patterns. And I think the polarization in our country has only gotten worse, and that's going to make it even easier to crack and pack marginalized and disadvantaged communities, and particularly rural parts of North Carolina, and make redistricting even more difficult to navigate this cycle. So what are we doing to get ready? Southern Coalition for Social Justice is partnering with Blueprint here in North Carolina and many other partners, but other partners across the South to run crowd academies. Our theory of change there is that we want to identify and cultivate trusted leadership and expertise on the ground, and remind people, convince people of their lived expertise as it applies to redistricting. Redistricting is about communities and it's about representation. And folks who live in these districts that we're talking about, these are not abstract districts. These are real communities and real people. And the folks who live there know what works for them and what doesn't. So we're putting computers and software, redistricting software, training on that software, and technical support over the next 2 years on the ground across the South as a means to deal with the fact that we did lose a critical part of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5. Section 5 was a part of the Voting Rights Act, also applicable in redistricting, but largely only covering parts of the South with a history of discrimination and voting. We lost Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, at least the mechanism in which it covered the South. We lost that in 2013 in a decision from the US Supreme Court called the Shelby County decision. And this will be the first redistricting cycle in decades when we haven't had the protections of Section 5. So we need to build our base of power and build our base of expertise to compensate for losing that important piece of the Voting Rights Act. Now, there are bills moving in Congress that might restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So I'm of the mind that we prepare for not having it, and maybe we get pleasantly surprised, but I'd rather be prepared. I also think as we talk about redistricting, that this is a moment too of bringing people in and understanding and talking about the larger cycle of civic engagement. So redistricting is a mechanism of accountability. If you are interested in engaging with decision makers to make good policy, redistricting is one powerful way to do that. If you get fair districts, it can be like strapping a rocket booster to your policy agenda. There's a lot of incentive for thinking about redistricting in a way that doesn't require reinventing the wheel every decade. Let's build on power and momentum we have and think about redistricting that way. I also think there's a great potential for in the moment that we're in to build an intersectional approach to progressive policy advocacy. Let's not silo ourselves. Let's not say I only work on education or environmental justice or criminal justice reform. Let's harness our skills and our talents and work together to ensure that at core, the building blocks of our democracy, how we elect candidates, that process is fair. And let's work on communicating with each other and sharing information so that we can make up for the loss of Section 5. Last cycle, when I was doing this redistricting engagement work, I could go on the United States Department of Justice's website and see what states that or counties that were covered under Section 5, they had extra disclosure requirements about their redistricting plans. And that got publicly posted. So I could look at a map for the Lenore County School Board and be like, this seems not right, and talk to some of my partners in Lenore County and be like, does this seem right to you? And we could spot problems that way, but that may not exist this time. Even if Congress moves quickly, time is short. And so by building these networks like we're doing tonight, getting to know each other, learning about what to look for, what kind of problems we can expect, that's how we get ready. That's how we mitigate the harm of losing Section 5. It's how we engage with redistricting in a really powerful way and change and dismantle systems of oppression for all of us. With that, I'm happy to take some questions because I know this is a lot of stuff that I've talked to you about, and I've tried to keep it high level, but I'm happy to spend the next whatever time we have left together answering questions.
Yeah, so we have until 6:45, and I've been sort of trying to collect questions as people have been putting them in chat. So I'll give you some questions kind of in no particular order. Michael, I think Schachter, I'm sorry, I keep mispronouncing your name, but asks, what are packing and cracking? Because that's something you talked about, and I think just maybe an explicit definition would be great.
Absolutely. So packing is when you take a concentration of voters. Historically, it's been Black voters, Latinx voters. It can also be Democratic voters, Republican voters, any voters who have some sort of shared identity or community. And you draw district lines to fence them in, to make the district as homogenous as possible, not because you necessarily are trying to create representation for that group. You're trying to keep whatever group you're trying to harm with that packing strategy. You're trying to keep them from being able to influence a larger number of elected officials. So that's packing. Draw crazy shaped lines to increase the number of whatever group you're trying to harm in a district. Cracking is the opposite. So you may, if you're a nefarious gerrymanderer, you may draw in a place like Wake County, for example, you would say, there's enough of this group that I don't like, that they're going to be able, I can't totally exclude them from the political process. So I just need to limit their voice. Where whatever group you're trying to hurt's numbers are a little bit smaller, you may see a cracking strategy instead, which is, okay, I have this group of Latinx voters, or I have this group of Democratic voters. And rather than draw a district that respects their community of interest, I'm going to split it up like a pizza pie, that population. And I'm going to strand a little bit of that Latinx population in each of these predominantly white districts so that the voice of those Latinx voters gets drowned out. That is cracking.
That's great. Such a good explanation, because I find that stuff really hard to explain. So we've had some different questions from a bunch of different people, sort of more about more voting rights stuff. So maybe just maybe a little bit about like, what is preclearance? What was that? And what is sort of left of the Voting Rights Act now that preclearance is no longer in effect?
So pre-clearance was essentially the enforcement mechanism of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act made it illegal in covered jurisdictions. So it was only some parts of the country, the South, and it was actually only 40 of North Carolina's 100 counties. It said it was illegal to put voters of color in a worse position than they had been, to change a voting law or a voting district to put voters of color in a worse position than they had been before the change. That's good. That allows us to not backslide. But the mechanism by which you would enforce that is the counties or the state, if some of the counties were covered, had to seek from the U.S. Department of Justice or a U.S. federal court in D.C. pre-clearance or pre-approval for any changes that affected voting, including redistricting maps. And they had to show to DOJ or that federal court that those changes wouldn't make voters of color worse off. That was pre-clearance, and it was a really powerful tool in protecting against backsliding, attacks on the voice of voters of color. And in 2013, the US Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, said that Section 5, where it was applied, wasn't justified by the congressional record anymore, that the times had changed and the South had changed. And Chief Justice Roberts essentially implied that he believed we were living in a post-racial society. That certainly does not accord with my lived experience. I think a lot of our lived experience as residents of the South. And Justice Ginsburg, in that opinion, in her dissent, wrote famously, "This is like throwing away your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm because you are not getting wet." And that's what Section 5 was. It was our umbrella in a vicious rainstorm. In fact, a rainstorm that I think has only gotten worse in the last 5 years. And so that's the reality that we are facing now. In the Shelby County decision, the Supreme Court only invalidated what's called the coverage formula, how Congress decided where Section 5 and the pre-clearance requirement applied. They didn't invalidate the pre-clearance requirement or Section 5 itself, but they said, Congress, you have to revise where it's applied. So Congress, there are bills doing that. There has not been the political will, particularly to get it through the Senate before now. Things have changed, and efforts are underway to restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act to as fulsome a coverage area as possible. I personally wouldn't be opposed to making this a national requirement. But it's also reasonable to expect, should Congress move quickly to restore and amend the pre-clearance provision, that it would be subject to lawsuits, and we may not be able to rely on it. So again, that's why I prepare for the worst. I try not to be too much of a Debbie Downer, but I'm planning as if we won't have an effective pre-clearance regime in place for redistricting this cycle.
Thanks, Allison. So Yvette asks, is sort of the irregular, misshapen looking districts the only way that we can identify if gerrymandering is happening?
Not at all. And in fact, shape it's an easy way, but I don't think it's the make all end all of both how we analyze redistricting maps or even bad acting. Here's an example. Especially in North Carolina, our municipalities are crazy shaped. And there's a sad history of discrimination in that too. But our cities, our counties aren't neat blocks and squares usually. And so you could draw a straight line and split the city of Greensboro, for example, to the great detriment of Greensboro residents, but it wouldn't be a crazy shaped or non-compact. You could just draw a district that was half of Guilford County, and it would look nice, but it would actually be very harmful and would be a gerrymander. It would dictate if you split Greensboro, you would essentially be cracking a concentration of voters of color and Democratic voters in a way that would guarantee or likely ensure that those voters' voices don't get adequately reflected in who gets elected. So it's not always the shape. What I would tell you is look past the shape of the district. Look to what you know about your county, about your towns, about your neighborhoods, and ask yourself, what's going on here? Why have they chosen to put different neighborhoods in different districts? The asking of the question is how you get to the issue spotting and figuring out if there's a potential problem. I will also say that folks who support community activists in doing redistricting engagement and monitoring, we need you to flag potential issues for us, but you don't necessarily have to have the answers. You just have to, be able to flag for us that this doesn't seem right. No one can explain to me why this district separates this neighborhood from that neighborhood, or why these precincts haven't been kept together. Asking those questions is helpful for flagging issues for us that we can follow up on.
All right, so here I think we'll take maybe two more questions, and here is I don't know if this is an opportunity for you to indulge your Debbie Downerness, but Kate asked, do you anticipate another decade of court challenges that'll mean it'll be 10 years before North Carolina voters get fair districts?
I never go into a redistrict. I mean, I do think it's fair to assume there will be litigation. I never go into it assuming it will take an entire decade. It is possible for the wheels of justice to move faster than they did last cycle. And it's not to say that they won't continue to move slowly in some places, but it doesn't have to be that way. And we do have the power to demand that our justice system be reformed. We can chew and walk gum at the same time. We can reform access to the courts and how fast our judicial system moves while we advocate for fair districts. And the two will benefit each other, even, even though we're not talking about like districts for electing federal judges, we still know how federal judges get their seats. And we know the interplay between the legislative branch and the judicial branch. So I think, all signs are that the leadership of the North Carolina General Assembly is not going to come to the table with good intentions, but I'll still show them how to do it right. I will be there, hopefully in person, maybe virtually, telling them how to do it right, and be willing to work with them if they change their mind. But if they're not, I think it's fair to anticipate litigation, but I also am committed to doing whatever I can to make sure that it doesn't last a decade. And don't remember, there's local redistricting too. And that is really, really important redistricting. And that doesn't, usually there's not the resources brought to bear on local redistricting efforts the way there are at the state legislative, meaning folks are more willing to compromise. There may not be millions of dollars of campaign money at stake. So folks, there can be a lot of good done there. And that's where I look to when I need some encouragement and need to resist my Debbie Downer urges.
All right, so we'll have one last question. Someone asked if they do want to get involved in these crowd academies, where would they find out more about that?
You would email me or Irving Zavaleta Jimenez at SCSJ and find out more information. We've got a bunch of website information on our website, www.scSJ. If you just follow this Crowd Academy logo up there in the right, you can find information about our fellows, our programs, our materials, but we're also happy to engage, and Irving is really talented and is directing that program work.
Well, Allison, thank you so much for your time. I know there were a ton of other questions that we couldn't get to, but I'm so glad that you came here and got to talk. I always feel like I learned so much when I listen to your presentations. So I'm so glad that you got to join this summit. And thank you to everyone for coming and attending Allison's presentation. I hope you come back at 7 p.m. when we will be having another panel with some people to talk about sort of what it's like to be in the legislature during redraw and how to best get involved there. So we will leave now. We'll close this session and thank Allison again. And then if you log back on using the same link used to get in this session, that will be how you'll attend the next session. You will probably get a message saying like waiting to let you in. That's because we close out these sessions in between so we can get our panelists ready, and then you'll be let in at 7 p.m. All right, well, thanks again, Allison. This was so great. So good to see you here. And we will see everyone again in a little bit. All right, bye.